The stage was set for a fiery exchange. It was primetime television, and millions of Americans tuned in to watch the National Pulse, one of the most polarizing political talk shows in the country. The show was known for its no-holds-barred debates, where conservative and liberal guests clashed in verbal duels that often went viral. Tonight's episode was special, not just because of the topic, but because of the guest. Karoline Leavitt, the rising star in conservative politics, was invited to discuss the upcoming election and the issues plaguing everyday Americans. Young, articulate, and fearless, she had built a reputation for standing her ground against mainstream media attacks. On the other side of the table sat Martin Reynolds, the liberal host notorious for his aggressive questioning and condescending tone toward conservative guests. He had taken down plenty of high-profile Republicans before, exposing what he called their dangerous ideologies. But tonight would be different. From the moment Karoline stepped into the studio, she could sense the tension. The producers barely greeted her. The makeup artist worked in silence, and the stage manager gave her a curt nod before directing her to the hot seat. She knew how this worked. Mainstream media didn't just invite conservatives to debate. They brought them in to destroy them. But she was ready. The cameras rolled. The intro music faded, and Martin plastered his signature smirk across his face. "Good evening, America," he began. "Tonight, we have a very special guest, someone who represents the new wave of right-wing politics, Karoline Leavitt. She's here to tell us why her vision for America is better than the one the majority of Americans voted for in 2020. Right away, the jab was obvious, but Karoline didn't flinch. She smiled politely, folded her hands on the table, and met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "Martin, thanks for having me," she said, her tone calm yet firm. "I'm happy to be here and talk about the future of this country, something millions of Americans feel the current administration is failing at." Martin chuckled condescendingly, flipping through his notes. "Let's get right to it," he said. "Many people, especially younger voters, believe that conservative policies are outdated, discriminatory, and quite frankly harmful to democracy. What do you say to that?" Karoline's smile didn't waver. She had faced these attacks before, but this was her moment. She leaned slightly forward, her voice unwavering. "I'd say that's an oversimplified narrative pushed by the media," she countered. "Young Americans are struggling to afford homes, facing skyrocketing inflation, and watching their freedoms erode under policies that promise equality but deliver nothing but government overreach. The real question is, why aren't you asking why liberal policies have failed the very people you claim to care about?" Martin's smirk faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, so you're saying progressivism is the problem? You don't think conservative policies, like opposing student loan forgiveness or reproductive rights, are part of the issue?" Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly. She was ready for this. "Let's talk about real issues, Martin," she said, her voice commanding. "You mentioned student loan forgiveness. What's the liberal solution? Taking money from blue-collar workers and handing it to Ivy League graduates? That's not fairness. That's socialism. Hardworking Americans shouldn't have to bail out people who chose expensive degrees in gender studies." The audience murmured. Even the panelists looked caught off guard. Karoline was only getting started. Martin Reynolds shifted in his chair, visibly caught off guard by Karoline's unapologetic response. He wasn't used to conservatives hitting back with such clarity and confidence. Usually, his guests would stumble, try to soften their positions, or attempt to appease the liberal audience. But Karoline? She was different. She wasn't backing down, and the energy in the room was shifting. Still, Martin wasn't going to let her dominate the conversation. He had a reputation to protect. He glanced down at his notes, a smirk creeping back onto his face. He had something prepared, something designed to rattle her. "All right, Karoline," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You talk a big game about personal responsibility and traditional values, but let's talk about reality. You're a young woman in politics, representing a party that's overwhelmingly led by men who want to control women's rights. How do you justify being part of a movement that wants to take America backward?" The trap was set. The implication was clear. Martin wanted to box Karoline into the tired, media-driven narrative that conservatives were anti-women, anti-progress, and anti-choice. The way he framed the question, it wasn't just a policy debate. It was an attempt to personally discredit her, to paint her as a traitor to her own gender. The audience leaned in. They had seen this before. This was the moment where Martin's guests usually fumbled, struggled to find the right words, or got defensive. But Karoline? She was calm. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Martin, that's an interesting way to frame the conversation," she said, her voice cool but pointed. "Because if you actually looked at the facts instead of liberal talking points, you'd know that conservative women are among the most empowered, independent, and successful individuals in America today. And do you know why?" Martin opened his mouth to interject, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. "Because we don't see ourselves as victims," she continued. "We don't need the government to lower the bar for us. We don't need men like you telling us what empowerment looks like. We believe in earning our place in society, not demanding handouts or lowering standards." The audience gasped. Martin's smirk was gone. He had expected her to deflect, maybe dodge the question, but instead, she had flipped it on him. Before he could recover, Karoline leaned in slightly, her tone sharpening. "You know what's truly ironic, Martin?" she said. "Liberals love to talk about women's rights, but they're the ones who can't even define what a woman is anymore. They're the ones forcing female athletes to compete against biological men. They're the ones cheering when a man takes a woman's spot on a magazine cover celebrating Women of the Year. So tell me, who's really taking America backward?" Silence. For the first time that evening, Martin Reynolds had no response. He had been outmaneuvered on his own show, and the audience felt it. The tension in the room was thick, but Karoline wasn't finished. She wasn't just here to survive. She was here to make a statement. The silence in the studio stretched longer than expected. Martin Reynolds, the liberal host known for cornering conservative guests, had just been publicly dismantled on his own show. The audience was stunned, and the control room producers were scrambling. They hadn't expected this. But Karoline wasn't done yet. She had sensed the momentum shifting, and in politics, just like in live television, you never waste an opportunity. She leaned back in her chair, offering Martin a moment to recover. "Martin, I'll give you a second," she said with a smirk, the confidence in her voice unmistakable. "I can see you weren't expecting that answer." A few scattered chuckles came from the audience. Martin, visibly irritated, shuffled his notes and attempted to regain control. Let's move on," he stammered. "You're dodging the issue. Conservatives claim to be about freedom, but your party is actively working to strip rights away from Americans. You talk about personal responsibility, yet you oppose free healthcare, free college, and you know what, let's get real. Why does your party continue to oppose racial equality policies and social justice initiatives that are helping marginalized communities?" There it was. The big accusation. The kind of question that wasn't designed to be answered. It was designed to brand her as the villain. A racist. A privileged conservative who didn't care about the struggles of minorities. But Karoline didn't hesitate. She was ready. "Oh, Martin," she sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "I love how the left throws around words like equality and justice while completely ignoring actual results." She turned slightly toward the audience, drawing them in. "You want to talk about equality? Let's talk about what happens when the left gets control of cities. Who's in charge of Chicago? Democrats. Who's in charge of Los Angeles? Democrats. Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, one-party rule for decades. And what do they all have in common? Skyrocketing crime, failing schools, homelessness out of control. You want to talk about helping marginalized communities? Maybe start by asking why liberal leadership has failed them for generations." Martin was seething. This wasn't how the conversation was supposed to go. He jumped in, his voice laced with frustration. "Oh, so you're blaming Democrats for systemic racism now? That's ridiculous. You're ignoring history." Karoline smiled. She had him exactly where she wanted him. "History?" she repeated. "Martin, let's actually talk history. Who fought against the Civil Rights Act? Democrats. Who founded the KKK? Democrats. who stood in the schoolhouse door to block black students from entering. Democrats. The Republican Party was literally founded to end slavery. You want to have a history lesson? I'll give you one. The audience erupted. It wasn't just conservatives in the crowd. There were independents, moderates, and even some left-leaning viewers who knew she had a point. This wasn't opinion. This was fact. Martin's face turned red. He tried to speak, but Karoline wasn't finished. She pointed a finger at him, her voice sharper now. And let's talk about modern policies. Who's pushing for open borders that bring in illegal immigrants, taking jobs away from Black and Hispanic Americans? Liberals. Who's driving up inflation so high that working-class families can't even afford gas and groceries? Liberals. Who's pushing an education system that tells kids their skin color determines their success or failure? Liberals. Martin had no response. The producers in his earpiece were probably screaming for him to cut to commercial. But Karoline delivered the final blow. You asked me why I'm a conservative? She said. Because I believe in real equality. The kind where everyone has a chance to succeed, not just the people the government chooses to prop up. Your party is obsessed with controlling people. Mine is about empowering them. The studio was electric. Some audience members even clapped. Something unheard of on a show where conservative guests were usually outnumbered and overpowered. Martin's show was supposed to be his battleground. But tonight, Karoline Leavitt was winning. The energy in the studio was undeniable. For the first time in the National Pulse history, the conservative guest wasn't just surviving the liberal host's attacks. She was dominating the conversation. Viewers at home could feel it, too. The live comment section on the network's streaming platform was exploding. She's crushing it. Finally, someone with the guts to fight back. Reynolds looks like he's about to explode, LOL. And Martin Reynolds did look like he was about to explode. He was gripping his pen tightly, his jaw clenched, his body language screaming frustration. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was the veteran journalist, the liberal heavyweight. Karoline Leavitt? She was supposed to be just another easy target, another conservative guest left stammering on his show. But instead, she had flipped the script. Martin took a deep breath. He had to regain control. Somehow. You're doing a lot of talking, Karoline, he said, forcing a smirk. But let's not ignore reality. Your side is constantly complaining about media bias, yet conservatives have their own massive propaganda machine, Fox News, talk radio, social media influencers. You act like you're the underdog, but your movement is spreading misinformation on a massive scale. How do you justify being part of that? Karoline let out a soft laugh and shook her head. She had expected this. It was the classic liberal playbook. Accuse conservatives of what the left was guilty of. Oh, Martin, she said, tilting her head. You really want to talk about media bias? You sit here on your nationally televised liberal talk show, pretending like conservatives have all the power in media. Let's be real, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Hollywood, big tech, academia, who controls all of them? Liberals. And yet, the moment a few conservative voices get a platform, you call it propaganda. The audience murmured in agreement. And misinformation? She continued, her tone sharper now. Let's talk about that. Who lied about Russian collusion for 4 years? The liberal media. Who suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story before an election? The liberal media. Who pushed lockdowns and mandates that turned out to be useless? The liberal media. Martin's lips tightened. He was scrambling. He had to change the subject. Fast. Well, he said, forcing a laugh. You're certainly good at spinning things, Karoline. But let's ask a real question. If conservatives really care about freedom, why do they support policies that limit women's reproductive rights? Or LGBTQ rights? Or voting rights? It seems like your idea of freedom only applies to people who agree with you. The audience tensed. It was an obvious gotcha question, but Karoline wasn't rattled. Instead, she leaned forward, locking eyes with Martin. Oh, so now you care about personal freedoms? She shot back. Where was all this energy when the government was forcing people to take vaccines they didn't want? Where was your outrage when parents were being labeled domestic terrorists for standing up to school boards? Where was your love for choice when people lost their jobs for refusing to comply with draconian mandates? The crowd gasped. Martin blinked. He had walked right into it. Let me make this simple for you, Martin, she said. Conservatives believe in actual freedom, where the government doesn't control your body, your speech, your business, or your child's education. The left only believes in freedom when it benefits their agenda. Martin was silent. His audience was silent. And at home, millions of Americans watching knew they had just witnessed something historic. The tension in the studio was electric. Martin Reynolds, the veteran liberal host, had run out of ammunition. His face, once smug and confident, now looked tight with frustration. The audience could feel it. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just holding her own. She was winning, and she wasn't finished yet. Martin, desperate to regain control, leaned forward. All right, Karoline, he said, his voice sharper now. You've had your fun, but let's talk about facts. Your party is led by a man who tried to overturn a democratic election. Your movement is fueled by conspiracy theories and misinformation. You talk about real freedom, but isn't it true that conservatives are the ones actually threatening democracy? Karoline let out a slow breath, then smiled. It was the kind of smile that signaled she had been waiting for this question. Martin, let me ask you something, she said, her voice measured but firm. When Democrats spend 4 years calling Trump illegitimate, was that an attack on democracy? When Hillary Clinton claimed the 2016 election was stolen, was that misinformation? When Stacey Abrams refused to concede in Georgia, was she a threat to democracy? Or does that only apply when Republicans question elections? Martin opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline didn't give him a chance. And let's be honest about January 6th, she continued. Was it a dark day? Yes. But don't sit here and pretend that one riot defines an entire political movement. Democrats spent months encouraging violent protests in 2020. Cities burned. Businesses were destroyed. People were killed. And what did the liberal media call it? Mostly peaceful protests. Spare me the outrage. The audience erupted. Martin's face turned red. He had lost control of the narrative. Karoline leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed. She had said what millions of Americans were thinking but never heard on mainstream media. I came here tonight knowing exactly what you'd do, she said, locking eyes with Martin. You'd frame the questions to make me look extreme. You'd talk down to me, mock my beliefs, and try to make conservatism seem like some fringe movement. But guess what? It's not working anymore. She turned slightly, addressing the audience directly. The American people are waking up. They're sick of being told they're the problem. They're tired of being silenced, censored, and labeled for daring to think differently. You want to know why I'm conservative? Because we're the only ones standing up for the people who built this country. Martin was speechless. The audience broke into applause, something that never happened on his show. Even the producers in the control room looked stunned. And across America, millions of viewers sat in shock. The clip would go viral within hours. Headlines would scream, Karoline Leavitt shuts down liberal host. Must-see TV. Karoline destroys leftist lies on live show. Conservative woman wipes the floor with liberal media darling. Martin Reynolds had invited Karoline on his show to humiliate her. Instead, she had left his career in shambles. And for millions of Americans watching at home, one thing was clear. The conservative movement wasn't going anywhere. It was just getting started.